In the heart of the Sierra de Urbasa in northern Spain, a dense, untouched forest remained like a dark stain on the map. They called it the Dark Wood, and it was surrounded by dark stories that local villagers told around campfires. Some said it was cursed, others swore that something lived among the trees, protecting it from intruders. But everyone agreed on one thing: no one should venture there after sunset. Alejandro, a 32-year-old photographer and explorer, dedicated his life to recording images of places forgotten by time. After years of traveling the world, he decided to return to Spain with a new purpose: to explore and document the enigmatic Bosque Oscuro. Skeptical by nature, Alejandro saw local legends as stories fabricated by the fertile imagination of superstitious people, nothing more than baseless myths. And before we continue with this intriguing story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us bring more content like this to you. Now, let's get back to the story. On the first morning, he arrived in the village of Zumárraga, where he rented a simple house to serve as a base. As soon as he mentioned his plan to explore the forest, residents began to avoid contact. The only exception was an old man named Don Ramon, who, with a look full of warning, approached him in the market. "You are young and fearless, but don't be foolish. The woods are no place for the living at night. There, something is watching us," said Don Ramon in a hoarse voice. Alejandro smiled but respectfully thanked him for the advice. "Don't worry, Don Ramon. I know what I'm doing. I'm just going to explore during the day. Nothing else." The old man snorted, shaking his head. "It's not up to you to decide. The forest has its own rules." That afternoon, Alejandro prepared his equipment: cameras, tripods, flashlights, a drone to capture aerial images, and a small audio recorder to record sounds of the forest. He decided to start early the next morning to explore the edge of the forest and return before dark. The morning was cold, but the sky was clear. Alejandro entered the trail that led to the heart of Bosque Oscuro. The forest seemed alive. Each step was accompanied by the sound of dry leaves crunching, the distant chirping of birds, and every now and then the snapping of branches that seemed to come from nowhere. He spent hours photographing the peculiar flora, marked by trees with gnarled trunks and thick moss that covered everything like a shroud. Some trees had strange markings, like deep scratches and symbols that looked like they were carved by hand. "Fascinating," Alejandro muttered as he recorded the images. As the day progressed, he became lost in the dark beauty of the place, but the atmosphere began to change. The air grew heavier, and the sounds of the forest ceased, leaving an oppressive silence. Feeling watched, he stopped walking and looked around. There was nothing but an uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. As the sun began to set, Alejandro realized he had gone further than planned. He decided to use the drone to find his way back, but when climbing the equipment, something strange happened. In the viewfinder, he saw a tall, humanoid figure among the trees, motionless, as if watching him. It had a misshapen shape and glowing eyes, reflecting like those of an animal at night. When he tried to maneuver the drone to get closer, the signal was cut and the device fell. Alejandro's logical mind tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was an animal or some strange light effect, but logic wasn't enough to calm his racing heart. He took his way back as the darkness approached too quickly. For a moment, Alejandro thought he heard light footsteps echoing behind him. Every time I stopped to look, nothing was there. He quickened his pace until he found the main trail, and finally, the exit of the woods. Upon arriving at the village, exhausted, he was greeted again by Don Ramon, who seemed to be waiting for him. "You saw something, didn't you?" asked the old man, his tone somber. Alejandro hesitated before responding. "I think it was just an animal." Don Ramon gave a dry laugh. "There is no just in the dark woods. If he saw something, it means he also saw you. Don't go back there, boy." But Alejandro was stubborn, and more than that, curious. That night, while reviewing the images on the camera, he noticed something that froze his blood. In several photos, always in the background, a tall, shapeless silhouette watched him from the shadows. Alejandro spent the night revisiting the images captured in the woods. In each of them, the humanoid figure appeared closer, but always obscured by shadows. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that in some photos, she seemed to be looking directly at him. "It can't be real," he muttered to himself. Sleep didn't come easily. He tossed and turned in bed, listening to the sounds of the night. Around 2 a.m, he woke up with a start to the sound of something scraping against the window. He ran to check, but found nothing but darkness. He took a deep breath, attributing the incident to his restless mind. The next morning, ignoring Don Ramon's advice and the latent fear in his chest, Alejandro decided to return to the dark forest. This time, I was more determined to capture concrete evidence of what I had seen. He took a high-resolution camera, more batteries for the drone, and even an audio recorder with a directional microphone. The villagers watched him silently as he set off into the forest again. Alejandro noticed the furtive glances and whispers, but ignored them. In the woods, Alejandro took a different path, going deeper. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. He found more of the strange markings on the trees, and this time, small amulets made of twigs and bones hung from low branches. They were similar to those he had seen in documentaries about protection rituals. At noon, he found a clearing. In the center, there was a circle of black stones that emanated a strange energy. The silence was absolute, and even the birds seemed to avoid that place. He took several photos and activated the audio recorder, capturing what he thought was just silence. However, when reviewing the audio, he heard a faint sound, like a distant whisper repeating a word, "skirt." A shiver ran through his body, but Alejandro was too skeptical to back down. He decided to explore further around the clearing. That was when he found something that froze his blood, a cave with an entrance covered in vegetation and marks, similar to those on the surrounding trees. Inside the cave, there were remains of ancient fires and bones. Some were too small to be animals. "This is bigger than I thought," he whispered, trying to rationalize what he saw. Suddenly, a sound made him freeze. Steps, but they weren't normal steps. They were heavy, as if something big was approaching. Alejandro turned off the camera and held his breath. He looked at the cave entrance, expecting to see some large animal. Nothing appeared. Time passed quickly, and before he knew it, the sun began to set. Alejandro hurried out of the cave and back to the trail, but the forest looked different. Each tree looked the same as the next, and the paths he was sure he'd marked were disappearing. He tried to use the GPS, but the signal was down. The feeling of being watched returned, now more intense. As he walked, he heard the sound of branches breaking again, but now they were closer. He stopped, pointed the microphone in the direction of the sound, and recorded. When he heard the audio, he regretted it. The sound of heavy breathing and footsteps echoed through the earpiece. Once again, a hoarse voice whispered, "I see you." Alejandro ran. His heart was racing as he tried to find his way out. The forest seemed like an endless maze, and darkness quickly took over the environment. He felt something following him, but he didn't dare look back. That's when he tripped over a root and fell, hurting his knee. As he tried to get up, he heard a low growl. Finally, he looked up and saw the creature for the first time. The creature was tall, at least 2 meters tall, but its appearance was more humanoid than he expected. The skin looked like tree bark, with parts lit by a flickering light, as if something was pulsing inside it. The eyes were bright yellow and seemed to penetrate Alejandro's soul. Its hands had long claws, and a smell of damp earth and rot emanated from it. "You shouldn't be here," said a deep but calm voice. It wasn't just a sound. Alejandro felt the words resonate inside his head. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. The creature approached slowly, tilting its head as if studying the intruder. Then, without warning, he disappeared into the darkness. Alejandro was paralyzed for minutes before he was able to move again. He knew he needed to get out of there as quickly as possible, but the forest didn't seem willing to let him go. As he ran, Alejandro began to notice shapes moving through the trees. They were smaller than the Guardian, but equally frightening, as if the forest itself were alive and working against him. Finally, after hours, he saw the light of the village in the distance. When he reached the final clearing, he didn't look back. When he arrived at the town, dirty and with his knee bleeding, he found Don Ramon waiting at the entrance. "I warned you. Now that he knows you, he will never forget you." Alejandro, for the first time, had no words. He just entered the house and locked the door, unable to sleep. When he finally closed his eyes, he had a disturbing dream. The creature was standing in the clearing, looking at him, whispering, "You'll be back." Alejandro woke up with a start, bathed in cold sweat. The dream of the night before, about the guardian of the forest, seemed more like a memory than a product of his imagination. He tried to convince himself that it was just the trauma of the experience in the woods, but an uncomfortable feeling persisted, as if something had come with him. Early in the morning, Alejandro decided to confront Don Ramon. He needed to understand more about what he was facing. He found the old man sitting in front of the market, rolling a cigarette with shaking hands. Alejandro wasted no time. "Don Ramon, who or what is that thing in the woods?" he asked directly, trying to hide the tension in his voice. The old man raised his eyes, which now seemed even heavier, marked by years of secrets. "He's the guardian. It was always there. It always will be. He protects the forest, not from you, but from all of us. It is said to have first appeared when humans began cutting down sacred trees to build roads. It only appears when someone disrespects what is theirs." "And what does he want from me?" Alejandro insisted, his voice rising a little. "You already know he marked you. Now it's a matter of time before you see him again." Don Ramon took a long drag on his cigarette before continuing. "There's a way to try to appease him, but no one knows if it works. This requires courage or madness." Although reluctant, Alejandro couldn't shake the idea of returning to the woods to get answers. He spent the day researching local legends in old books he found in the village. One in particular caught his eye, a faded diary of a 17th century monk that recounted similar events. In it, the monk described an entity in the forest that protected a hidden heart, something essential to the life of the forest. "If I find this heart, maybe I can understand what it protects, or why it pursues me," thought Alejandro. Based on the diary, he identified an area of the woods that the monk called Shadowglade. The description matched the clearing he had found the day before. Determined, Alejandro began preparing for another incursion. This time, Alejandro waited for dusk before entering the woods. He knew that the night was where the greatest mysteries hid, and this time, he didn't intend to run away. Armed with his recorder, cameras, and powerful flashlights, he followed the trail that led to the Glade of Shadows. The forest seemed more alive than ever. Every broken branch, every rustle of leaves seemed charged with intent. Alejandro realized he was being watched, but continued advancing. When he arrived at the clearing, he found something that wasn't there before. Stones, arranged in the shape of a circle, with strange symbols painted on them. In the center, a colossal tree with a crack in its trunk seemed to pulse with a faint light. Alejandro felt he had found the heart mentioned in the diary. As he approached, a low sound filled the air. It was as if the entire forest was breathing around him. He placed the recorder next to the tree and began documenting. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind. "You don't belong here." Alejandro fell to his knees, feeling a crushing weight on him. When he looked up, there was the creature. The guardian of the forest had appeared again, but this time he was not alone. Smaller, shadowy, almost spectral figures emerged from the shadows surrounding the clearing. "What do you want from me?" Alejandro shouted, his voice shaking between fear and despair. The creature tilted its head as if considering the question. Then, with a slow gesture, he pointed to the tree. "Choose. Either you become part of the forest, or it becomes part of you." Alejandro didn't understand immediately, but a terrible sense of inevitability came over him. He realized he had two options: abandon his life and become one with the forest, or accept some kind of dark pact with the creature. Time seemed to stop as Alejandro reflected. He knew that running away was no longer an option. The Guardian was connected to him in some way, and only an agreement could end that torment. I choose to understand," he finally replied, his voice almost a whisper. With a quick movement, the Guardian extended his misshapen hand, touching Alejandro's forehead. A wave of images invaded his mind: forest fires, trees being felled, animals fleeing in despair. And then, a familiar face, himself, setting camera traps and disrespecting nature's sacred boundaries. Alejandro fell onto his back, panting. The Guardian spoke once again. "Now you carry the burden. Be our messenger." When he regained consciousness, Alejandro was alone. The Guardian and the shadowy figures were gone, but he felt something different inside him, something that connected him to the forest. With difficulty, he stood up and began to walk out of the forest. This time, the trees seemed to help him, clearing the way for him to get out. When he reached the town, Don Ramon was waiting for him again. "What did you do, boy?" asked the old man with wide eyes. "I don't know, but I think I'm part of it now." Alejandro woke up the next day with a weight on his chest, as if last night had left marks that went beyond his body. He couldn't explain it, but he felt different. The images the Guardian had shared in his mind remained vivid. Devastating fires, trees falling like defeated giants, and the harrowing sound of animals fleeing for their lives. He also knew that something bigger awaited him. Over the next few days, Alejandro began to notice subtle changes. He had recurring nightmares about the dark woods, but the most disturbing thing was waking up with his hands covered in dirt, as if he had been digging during the night. One day, while washing his face, he noticed something even stranger. His nails seemed thicker, almost claw-like. He decided to look for Don Ramon once again. He found the old man in the same square, but this time he seemed anxious, as if he were waiting for Alejandro. "The Guardian isn't just a legend, is he?" Alejandro asked bluntly. Don Ramon sighed deeply. "No, he's as real as you and me. But you went above and beyond, boy. He did something no one should have done. Now it's connected to him, and the forest does not forgive those who carry its burden." Alejandro felt a shiver. He didn't know exactly what Don Ramon meant, but the feeling that he was changing disturbed him deeply. That night, Alejandro decided to listen to the audio he had recorded in the forest. Sitting in his small house, he pressed play and let the sound fill the silence. For minutes, everything seemed normal. Leaves swaying, birds chirping, the rustling of vegetation. Then a low, continuous sound began to emerge, like a deep breath. And soon after, the same voice he had heard in the clearing echoed, low and threatening. "Don't run away from who you are now." He stopped recording immediately, his heart beating wildly. He felt something inside him stir, as if the Guardian was still present. The next morning, Alejandro was awakened by a commotion in the village. He ran to the square and found the villagers crowded together, talking about a fire that had started on the edges of the dark wood during the night. The fire, which threatened to destroy part of the forest, was something Alejandro knew the Guardian would not tolerate. He felt a strange urge, almost a need, to do something. Against his will, he grabbed a backpack with water and ran into the woods. Upon arrival, he noticed that the fire appeared limited, but was spreading quickly. "I can help. I need to help," he muttered to himself as he began to pour water on the flames. As he fought the fire, he felt something different. It was as if the forest was alive around him, guiding him to the most critical points. The flames seemed to recede, and he felt an energy pulsing around him. In the end, exhausted and covered in soot, Alejandro realized that the fire had been contained. When he returned to the village, the looks were not of gratitude, but of fear. People whispered among themselves, pointing at Alejandro. Don Ramon approached, holding him by the arm. "They know you were marked. They know that you are different now." "How different? What does this mean?" Alejandro asked, frustrated. Don Ramon hesitated before answering. "It means you no longer fully belong to our world. The forest is now part of you, and you are part of it." Before Alejandro could respond, a woman from the village approached, visibly nervous. "You brought this to us. Since arriving, strange things have started to happen. The fire, the sounds in the forest," she accused. "I didn't do any of that." Alejandro defended himself. "I tried to help. If it weren't for me, the fire would have spread to the village." But his words only seemed to increase the villagers' terror. They began to disperse, casting suspicious glances at Alejandro. Back at the house, Alejandro sat at the table, trying to understand what had happened. The Guardian had said he carried a burden. Would it be your mission to protect the forest? And if so, how could he do it alone? That night, he decided to return to the woods. It was as if an invisible force was calling him. He followed the same trail to the glade of shadows, and when he got there, he found the Guardian waiting for him. This time, however, the creature seemed calmer, almost as if it were assessing. "You saved the forest today, but this is just the beginning. What do you want from me?" Alejandro asked, his voice choked with anger and fear. "I want you to see, to feel, to understand what is at stake." Suddenly, the Guardian raised one of his hands, and Alejandro was flooded with another vision. He saw the future, the forest reduced to ashes, the rivers dry, and the animals disappeared. And then he saw himself, standing among the trees, like an extension of the Guardian himself. When the vision ended, Alejandro was on his knees, panting. "Do you want me to become like you?" he asked in disbelief. The Guardian didn't respond, but Alejandro understood. He now had a choice: continue to flee and be destroyed, or accept his role as protector of the forest. Back at the village, Alejandro made a decision. He began writing about the forest, recording the legends and mysteries to warn people about the importance of respecting that place. At the same time, he was preparing for the inevitable, his definitive return to the forest to take his place as the next Guardian. He knew the path would be lonely, but something inside him told him it was the right thing to do. The air of the village seemed heavier to Alejandro. The days became more difficult, with the villagers openly avoiding him. To them, he was no longer just a curious stranger. It was a symbol of something they feared. Alejandro's nights were haunted by visions of the Guardian and the burning forest. The internal pressure grew every moment until finally an unexpected event precipitated the final confrontation. The morning everything changed. Alejandro was woken up by screams in the square. He ran to find out the reason for the commotion and found a terrifying scene. A group of men armed with chainsaws and axes had arrived at the village, claiming to have authorization to deforest part of the Oscuro forest. Don Ramon, among other villagers, begged the men to give up. "You don't know what you're doing," he shouted. "This forest is not like the others. It's sacred." The men laughed, indifferent to the pleas. The leader, a burly man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, shook his head. "These are stories to scare children. We are here to work." Alejandro, listening to the conversation, felt his blood run cold. He knew that the forest would not tolerate such an affront, and that the Guardian would react. Before he could interfere, the men left with their equipment, ignoring the protests. That night, as the residents retired, Alejandro felt an irresistible force pulling him towards the woods. He knew the Guardian was waiting for him, and this time, it wasn't for a conversation. He grabbed his backpack and left, knowing he might not return. When he entered the dark woods, he noticed that something was different. The normally quiet and oppressive environment was filled with the sounds of movement. The forest seemed to be alive, but agitated, like a cornered animal. He walked to the glade of shadows, where he found the Guardian, imposing, surrounded by the spectral figures he had seen before. "They are violating the heart of the forest," the Guardian's voice echoed in his mind. Alejandro felt the weight of those words. He knew the men would not stop until they were forced to, but he also knew that if the Guardian decided to act, he would be ruthless. "I can help you stop this. But we need to find another way, without violence," Alejandro said, trying to contain his despair. The Guardian studied him for long moments before responding. "You still don't understand. What they take from us, we cannot recover. You must choose, defend the forest or be lost with it." Alejandro felt the responsibility weighing on his shoulders. For the first time, he realized that the Guardian was not just a violent entity, it was the last line of defense for something much older and more essential. Without waiting, Alejandro followed the sound of chainsaws and found the group already inside the forest, cutting down the first trees. He shouted, trying to stop them, "You need to stop! Now!" The men looked at him with disdain, but the leader approached with a mocking smile. "Are you going to stop us alone, boy?" Before Alejandro could respond, a strong wind blew through the forest, bringing a deep, ominous sound. The surrounding trees began to sway violently, even though there was no storm. "What the hell is that?" asked one of the men, visibly scared. Then the Guardian appeared. His colossal figure emerged from the shadows, eyes glowing like embers. The workers screamed, dropping their equipment and running in various directions. The leader tried to raise his weapon, but something invisible disarmed him. "Let them go," Alejandro shouted, placing himself between the Guardian and the remaining men. The Guardian stopped, tilting his head to the side, as if considering Alejandro's audacity. "They took too much. There is no forgiveness. But there is another way. I can protect the forest. I can guarantee that no one else will hack it." Alejandro felt the forest around him become completely silent, as if he was awaiting the Guardian's decision. The Guardian approached Alejandro, so close that he could smell earth and rot. Then the deep voice echoed once again. "Do you promise?" Alejandro knew this wasn't just any promise. It was a life or death pact. Without hesitation, he replied, "Yes, I promise." With a slow gesture, the Guardian raised one of his hands and placed it on Alejandro's chest. An intense pain shot through his body, and he felt something being ripped from within him. When the Guardian stepped back, Alejandro realized that something had changed. He felt the forest like never before. Every leaf, every root, every creature that inhabited that place. He was now part of the forest. The remaining men fled, taking with them the story of a monster that protected the forest. Don Ramon, who had followed Alejandro from afar, witnessed the moment he fell to his knees, exhausted but alive. "You did the impossible, boy," said Don Ramon, with tears in his eyes. The woods had never been quieter than that night. Alejandro, kneeling in the glade of shadows, felt every part of the forest pulsate as if it were an extension of himself. Every leaf in the wind, every movement in the shadows, was part of his consciousness now. He knew there was no return. His life was irrevocably intertwined with the dark woods. Don Ramon, the only villager who had dared to follow him, watched in silence. Even from a distance, I felt the change in Alejandro. It wasn't just the deeper gaze or the exhausted posture. There was something otherworldly about him now, an aura that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. "What did you do, boy?" Don Ramon whispered, but Alejandro just shook his head, still processing what had happened. The next morning, Alejandro returned to the village, walking slowly as if each step was a challenge. The villagers watched him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. They whispered among themselves, but no one came closer. Alejandro realized that he was now a stranger, not only in the woods, but also in the place he called his temporary home. As he entered his house, he felt a presence around him, as if the forest had followed him. The sound of trees rustling, even in the absence of wind, was constant. He took out his diary and started writing, trying to organize his thoughts. but the words that emerged were fragmented, almost poetic, as if they were dictated by another force. "I'm not just Alejandro. I'm part of something bigger," he wrote, stopping to take a deep breath. The nights that followed were equally disturbing. Alejandro dreamed of the Guardian and the forest in perfect harmony. But he also saw the future, new invasions, destruction, and death. He knew he needed to act. Days later, a group of researchers arrived at the village, attracted by rumors of a haunted forest. Equipped with cameras and motion detectors, they intended to document what they called local myths. Alejandro, knowing what that meant, tried to dissuade them. "You have no idea what you are doing. It's not safe. Leave the woods alone," he begged. But the men laughed, thinking he was just another superstitious villager. "We're not here to hunt monsters, friend. We just want answers," replied one of the researchers, not knowing what was coming. That night, Alejandro followed them, closely following their movements through the forest. He knew the Guardian was aware of their presence. When the men arrived at the Shadow Glade, they began assembling equipment, ignoring the warning signs around them. The hanging amulets, the branches twisted into strange shapes, and the absolute silence. Suddenly the wind picked up, and the shadows of the trees seemed to move. Alejandro felt the Guardian approaching. He knew that this time there would be no warning. With a superhuman effort, he intervened. "Stop now! You need to leave," he shouted, positioning himself between the researchers and the clearing. The men hesitated, but before they could react, the Guardian emerged from the shadows, his immense, intimidating figure illuminated by the dim light of the moon. Researchers panicked, dropping equipment as they tried to flee. Alejandro, however, stood firm. "I promised to protect you. They don't understand, but I do," he said to the Guardian in a loud voice. The Guardian stopped, watching Alejandro for long seconds before disappearing into the darkness, leaving only the rustling of leaves as a witness. The next morning, Alejandro learned that his presence in the village was unsustainable. The villagers already suspected him, and rumors about the previous night only increased their fear. Even Don Ramon, who supported him from the beginning, seemed reluctant to face what Alejandro had become. "You belong in the woods now, boy. This village is no longer your home," said Don Ramon, with sadness in his eyes. Alejandro silently agreed. He packed a few things in his backpack and walked to the edge of the forest. He looked back one last time, seeing the faces of the villagers watching from afar before disappearing into the trees. The days turned into weeks, and Alejandro began to understand his new role. He was a guardian, but not as the previous one. While the former Guardian was a force of relentless destruction, Alejandro sought balance. He wandered hunters, warned explorers, and at rare moments allowed curious to see the beauty of the woods, but always under his vigilance. Over time, the connection between Alejandro and the woods deepened. He could hear the whispers of the trees, feel the movement of animals, and even predict climate change. He was no longer human in the full sense of the word, but it was no longer a creature of the forest either. Years later, a group of young people ventured into the woods, ignoring legends and warnings. They found a tall man with a deep look and hands that looked like wood, waiting for them in the shadow clearing. "This place is not for you. Return and tell people what they have seen," said Alejandro, his calm but authorized voice. The young people fled, taking stories of a human guardian that protected the woods. Gradually, the Oscuro Grove has become an untouchable place, respected by all. Alejandro knew that his sacrifice had been worth it. He was no longer Alejandro. It was the woods, and the woods were him. Decades have passed since Alejandro made his sacrifice. The Dark Grove had become a protected reserve, a sacred place where no one dared to enter without purpose. The legends of the human guardian continued to spread, growing in mystery and respect. Time made Alejandro disappear from the memories of the village, but in the heart of the forest, his presence was eternal. A young researcher named Lucia arrived at the village for a different purpose. She was not like the others who came after fame or superficial curiosity. Lucia grew up listening to the stories of the Oscuro Grove, told by her grandfather Don Ramon, who spoke with reverence for the Guardian. If you ever go there, go with respect. The woods recognize who comes in peace, he said. Guided by these words, Lucia has prepared carefully, bringing only what is necessary and leaving behind any intention of invasive exploitation. When he reached the woods, he immediately felt the change in the air. Each step seemed guided by an invisible force. Upon reaching the clearing of the shadows, she saw something few had witnessed. A tall figure with human traits, but clearly no longer totally human. Alejandro, now the full guardian of the woods, was standing under the large tree that throbbed with weak light. "Did you come looking for something?" asked Alejandro, his voice echoing as the rustle of the leaves. Lucia was surprised, but not afraid. He bent down in a gesture of respect before answering, "I didn't come to take anything. I just want to understand and protect how my grandfather said you did." Alejandro tilted his head, his eyes shining with a tone of curiosity. It was rare for someone to enter the woods with such pure intentions. "So you understand the price? This place does not belong to the world outside. It exists by itself," he said, watching her closely. Lucia nodded. "Yes, my job will be to make sure no one else tries to exploit or destroy it. The world needs places like this." For a long moment, the Guardian remained silent. Then, with a slow gesture, he indicated that she approach the tree. When Lucia did, he felt a wave of heat and energy by walking his body. It was as if the forest was accepting it. "You are allowed to leave with what you have seen here, but remember, this woods only remain while protected," Alejandro concluded. Lucia returned to the village, thrilled with what she had experienced. He became a fervent defender of the woods, publishing only carefully selected fragments of his experience, never revealing the Guardian's true secret. The world outside the woods never knew the whole story, but those who respected the place began to consider it a symbol of hope and balance. Inside the woods, Alejandro continued his vigil. He no longer felt time like humans. The station cycle was its only measure, and the woods its only company. He knew that his existence was finite, but as long as the forest remained alive, he would do so too. On clear nights, those who dared to look at the dark woods from afar swore to see a weak light in the clearing of the shadows. Others said he heard the rustle of the leaves forming whispered words. For the villagers, this was proof that the Guardian was still there, fulfilling his promise. And so the dark forest remained untouched and eternal, protected by the one who sacrificed everything to keep him alive. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We love to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support our work. See you in the next video.